looks like we are live. Triple check. Yes. All right, we are live, everybody. Let me just get a little bit of a cleanie on the this guy. It looked like I saw a little light ray. There we go. It's somewhat better. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another camera class. My name is Saxon, and today it is the first of the month, and funny enough, it lines up with the first. So we are doing camera basics. So for anybody new to this, each week we do a presentation on cameras. It's every Thursday of the month. Each week is a different topic or subject on cameras and kind of what to understand. This week's camera class is camera basics. So the idea behind this class is that we're going to teach the very beginning parts of what you should know. Typically what I tell people all the time is really what you should be knowing in this is that we're moving from a smartphone or a rudimentary understanding of what intro level camera depth or understanding is, and we're getting into something a little more complex. By complex, I mean basically buttons, where are those located, what you should know about cameras, mirrorless DSLR, just info that'll help you either make an educated guess when you're buying a camera to help you understand what you're looking for, or if you're someone who just purchased a camera, maybe a better rudimentary understanding of what it is that a camera does and how it can differ from being a smartphone. Later in the class, I'll talk a little bit about how your camera is different from your smartphone, but to really break it down for you now, cell phone companies like Apple, Samsung, Google, they've designed their phones in such a way, and their cameras specifically, to make it very easy for you to take a photo. It's a quick snapshot. It's something that's simple. It's not necessarily the most thought out process, but it's something that for you, the beginning user of a camera who just wants to take a picture of your kids or your family during the holidays or whatever it is that you're doing, it's a quick and easy function. But before phones were invented and before even disposable cameras became a thing, cameras weren't necessarily the most easy thing to use. They required a little bit more knowledge and skill, and a lot of the times that knowledge and skill went into crafting a really amazing photo. So that's what we're really here today to figure out. So to break it down for you, we're going to start from the very beginning for what I think everybody should know, and then we're going to move into a little bit more complex kind of ideologies or actual facts on cameras. Next week we will then have another class, the week after, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that. But to get started, get into it before I bore you all. Oh, by the way, my name is Saxon. I teach every camera class here on Thursdays at Apple Electronics. Let's start with the first part. So, where to go when all else fails. I talk about this a lot. If you're brand new to this, always read your owner's manual. Your owner's manual is going to have basically everything you need to know about cameras in there or about your camera model. It's usually a pretty thick booklet. Some of the newer cameras might not even give you one, but it's important that if you did get one or if you bought one and they say the owner's manual is online or somewhere else, read through it, get familiar with it. It tells you what every button does, what every menu system does. And even if it's something that, I don't want to read it, maybe you have a question on, what does this exact button do? If you just flip through the camera booklet, you should find a section where it shows you each button, gives you a number next to it. You flip to that page, and then from there, it'll break down the form and functionality of that button. So read the owner's manual. If you're not interested in doing that, Imaging Resource is one of my favorite tools. I tell customers about it all the time. It's a blog-style website. If you've got a problem or a thought or an issue with your camera, you want to get it resolved or you want to figure out more about it, Imaging Resource is your place to be. They also have a podcast as well. It's very nerdy and spec and detail oriented on cameras. So if you're not looking for, how many megapixel or how many point pixels are inside your actual sensor of your camera or other really refined and detailed information on why Blackmagic and the FX lineup from Sony are different, you probably don't want to listen to that. But if you care, it's a good option too. Canon, Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, Leica, Olympus, Fuji, every camera website has their own, every camera company has their own website. From that information too, they all have detailed information. I really love the Nikon website. I think they do a great job of lining stuff up for not only their cameras, but for basic photography users too. If you're brand new to taking photos, take a look at one of the websites and just get familiar with the information and content they have on there. They have a lot to help you get started that isn't necessarily as, crazy as trying to understand each individual button. It could just be understanding what focal length means and what, your aperture is and all that different stuff. And my go-to, I think it's what people call the GOAT, I would say, is YouTube. If you ever have an issue, just type your camera model in on YouTube, and I guarantee you there's 100 different videos out there that just talk about your one camera. All the time I get customers who ask, what's the first thing you should do with your camera? I like to look up 10 things you didn't know about X model camera, whatever that is. There are going to be so many camera nerds out there like myself who will just break down tons of different points of information. Maybe give you tidbits on what settings to turn onto your camera to make it easier to do X, Y, Z. It's the little things like that that could turn your camera experience into a very easy process or a fun process. And maybe along the way too, as you change those settings, you'll learn a little bit too of what you changed. So maybe in the future you can go back and do it yourself or keep tweaking things until you get something to the point you want to be. Also, at any point in time during this video, if you guys have comments, questions, or concerns, as long as they're appropriate, just chat in on the video. I'll read them out loud and then answer that question for you, so whatever that is. But let's keep moving. So the first thing I think that's important with cameras is that you understand there is no internal storage on your camera. They do that purposely because for whatever reason, everybody has a different kind of mode of saving their photos. That could be that they're more video oriented, or they're more on the raw side of the photo taking, or maybe they're just taking simple JPEGs. So it's important that you do a little research on what SD cards are the most appropriate for you. I typically recommend at least doing a 64 gigabyte SD card, and if you are going to do video, I would look at something with a faster speed. And typically on the card, it'll give you a read and write speed, and it'll either say megabytes, that's usually what it'll say. From there, I always recommend you have two of them. And the reason I say that is because when you are out in the field, sometimes on the back of these SD cards, it's copper strips that are connecting inside the camera. Over time, those can get damaged or erode or just, for whatever reason, not work or respond anymore. So if you get out there and you're ready to take photos and you put your SD card in and it doesn't load, a lot of the times it could just be fried. And if you don't have another SD card, then you're sitting in hot water because you just maybe drove all the way out to do photos. Maybe it's your son's championship baseball game or your daughter's final ballet recital or whatever exactly it is, and now you can't take any photos except with your phone. So try to have two SD cards at all times. Now, pictures should never live on the memory card. I use the analogy of that your camera is your home and your computer is your place of work. The SD card travels in between to then bring the photos from one device to the other. As you're going and as you're doing stuff on there, you're going to transfer them to your computer or to your phone or whatever the easiest process is. I do recommend a computer for the screen size. And then you're going to delete those photos and reuse the card over and over and over again. So these are my steps and processes for after you're done taking the photos. The reason I put this in the very beginning is I get a lot of customers that will take photos and they will just build them up for a year, never do anything with them, and then all of a sudden come to me and say, okay, what do I do next? Well, now it's a bigger problem, not problem, but now it's a bigger kind of conundrum to figure out. Where were these photos taken, at what time, how do you want to save them? So this is my recommendation. You go to an event, you take photos, you're done, come home, here's what you're going to do. You're going to turn that camera off if you haven't already, which you should have turned it off. And you're going to wait at least 5 seconds. This gives the camera enough time to power down, cool down, and if it's saving or making any final changes inside the SD card, it can do so within that 5 seconds before you then remove the card. Once the card's removed, place that into a reader. Now, I do recommend using a card reader. I try to avoid using the camera to transfer photos to the device, device being your computer. The reason being is that accidents happen. You know, if you're accidentally unplug the camera from the computer, you could lose all your photos. If, let's say, it's a long night, maybe you're sitting down with a beer, glass of wine, or just a water, you knock it over on accident, you could not only damage the camera and the laptop, obviously, but then if it's transferring or in the midst of transferring, it could lose everything in the process. At least if you were using the SD card. Most SD cards are some form of rugged proof where they can take a little bit of water damage, they can take a little heat damage, and they're okay. The electronic components on a camera, depending on the level of camera you have, might not be the same. So try to avoid using the camera to transfer the photos to the device. Remove that card and place it into a card reader. If you're new to the game, a card reader looks something like this. There's multiple versions out there, but invest in a card reader. If you have a MacBook, some of the newest MacBook Pros out there have a SD card reader. Some computers from the Windows portion too have SD card readers. If you've got one of those, totally fine. If you don't, which I would say a majority of people don't, get a card reader, helps you download everything, just makes your life a little bit easier. Next thing you want to do is copy photos to a destination folder. Now I say copy, don't move them. Reason being, let's start with this, destination folder. On your computer, if you're using Windows, you're going to use Explorer. If you're using Mac, you're going to use Finder. You're going to create a brand new folder. You can name it whatever you want. I am very anal about how I store my photos and how I organize things on my computer. The way that I go about it is I go by years. I have photos from the last 15, 16 years on my computer. When I go through everything, I label everything by the year. When I click on the year, it's labeled by month, and every month is then labeled by the event with the date. So let's say that this year, 2024, in July, I went to my kids' baseball game, and it was my kids' team was the Cubbies, and they were playing the Cardinals. What I might say is, Youth League, Cubbies versus Cardinals, 7-12. That might be the name of my folder. And in there is going to be all the photos from that day that I went. When we're doing that, the reason I say to copy them and not move them is because if we duplicate them from the SD card, let's say for whatever reason, it becomes unplugged or the transfer doesn't go through all the way. If we move them, then we're physically changing the location from one to the other, meaning that if it stops, there's a chance that the photos in between that transfer are lost forever. But if we're just making a duplication of them, then at least we know that they're still on the source and we can get them back at any point in time. So copy them to one location from the other to make it easy for you. Lastly, you want to copy them to another place. I do recommend having a backup. You've heard the horror stories of losing your computer and not being able to get anything off of them. Photos are in the same boat. There used to be a time where you'd have the bin or the Tupperware or bin full of photos or a photo album of some sort at grandma's house. She keeps that stuff safe. She's good about that. But you, on the other hand, you're changing. You're moving around in life. Things are moving. So having a secondary location for the photos, especially digital files, is a crucial and important thing. So move them to a second place. Copy them to a second place. External hard drives are great. Things like Prime Photos or Google Drive, those are great options too. I personally like an external hard drive. It's easy. I like tangible items too. Next thing you're going to do is eject the card before physically removing it. So on the bottom of your computer, if it's a Mac, you can drag it to the trash can. If it is a Windows computer, you left click and then you should be able to then click the eject button on there. That's then going to force the computer to stop all applications with the card and make it primed so it's good to remove. Next thing you're going to do is format the card in the camera. Now, I do say this because formatting will erase the old information on the card. It also preps the card so that it's ready for that camera. If maybe, like myself, you shoot between a Leica and a Sony, sometimes I use the same card in between those two cameras. And with that being said, if I'm using the same card, if I format it, it's formatted specifically for the camera that I'm using. Just make sure that the storage is optimal and it makes sure that whatever information I'm putting on there, it's primed for it. I'm trying to think of a good example for that, but it would basically be like if you have an issue with your car, you're not going to buy necessarily parts for, if you drive a Jeep, you're not buying parts for an Acura, you're going to buy parts for the Jeep. If you have your SD card, that SD card can kind of work for anything, but as long as it's formatted for that, it means that it's perfectly fit and the parts are proper for whatever camera you're using. Now if you're only using that one card and formatting confuses you and you don't want to go through that mess, someone formatted your card once and that's good enough for you, you can also delete them while they're still in the computer. Just select everything, drag it to the trash can, and delete it. It's an easy way to clear that information off, that way you don't get mixed up on events, and it's smooth. So here's the backup plan in pictures to make it simple. It starts with the SD card, like I said, at least 64 gigabytes or higher at the minimum. If you can only afford a 32 or a 16 gigabyte, by all means, but I do recommend a 64 in case you want to take a little bit of video, or maybe you go on a vacation for a month, you have no access to a computer, but you got your camera. This way you have optimal storage. Then from the SD card, we go into the computer. Remember, we copy them to the computer, we don't move them. Then once they're copied to the computer, we copy them again to one of two locations, an external hard drive, which is my personal favorite, or a cloud-based solution. I highly recommend, if you have never tried one, look into a cloud-based solution. It's easy, you can access it anywhere in the world, and it's one of those things where as long as you can remember a username and password, you're going to easily be able to log into anything. So Google Drive being one of the most famous, OneDrive, if you're someone who uses Microsoft, you have access to that. And then Adobe Creative Cloud is another good one too. You get all the Adobe apps available to you as well. And it just makes it really easy to edit the photos and play with them on there as well too. So before we get into a little bit more of the layout of the camera and other information, there's three types of cameras you should know about: DSLR, mirrorless, point and shoot, or bridge camera. Mirrorless and point and shoot are going to be very similar. The biggest difference between them is going to be the fact of the interchangeable lens. Mirrorless and DSLR have the ability for you to remove the lens from the camera, where a point and shoot doesn't. But a point and shoot, much like its mirrorless counterpart, is going to use a digital image sensor on the inside. Where a DSLR differs from those two models is that it uses a mirror, and it's what you call a digital single lens reflex. The mirror flips up, burns an image into the sensor, and that's how you get the picture. In a mirrorless and point and shoot, the image goes right through the lens into the sensor, and that's how we see what we're seeing. DSLRs are becoming a thing of the past. Most camera companies, if not all of them, have slowly but surely been discontinuing models, not making them anymore, and slowly been keeping them away. The reason being is that mirrorless technology has been proven to be faster, better in low light sensitivity, better at autofocusing, better at object tracking. There are so many advances in the mirrorless community and technology that it's really outshining the DSLR. And if you would have asked, 15 years ago, if someone would have thought that's true, they would have laughed at you. But then again, if you would have asked 15 to 20 years prior to that, nobody would have thought film was going anywhere either. Technology keeps advancing. These photography or these photo companies and camera companies keep trying to create technology that's up to date, but gives you the best and most priceless image possible. When you think about it, how far cell phones have come with a camera on the inside, it would have been hard to think that cell phone cameras would then eventually replace most of the traditional camera taking, until those traditional camera takings have now become more powerful than your traditional cell phone cameras. So it's always that balance in between, and it's amazing to see how times change. Let's go over a tour of your camera now. So we broke those down. We've really kind of understood a little bit of what the difference is. I have some images real quick though to break it down a little bit further. So, like I said, mirrorless and point and shoot, very similar. Only difference between them is the fact that mirrorless and has interchangeable lenses. Point and shoot, you cannot change the lens. So, when we go through everything, a DSLR has the mirror on the inside. Light comes in, bounces off the mirror, cuts through a pentaprism, and that's how you can see through an optical viewfinder. If you have an old DSLR lying at home, keep the camera off, look through the viewfinder, and you're going to be able to see through it. That's because there's a mirror that's in there. If you try to do that with a mirrorless, it's not going to work, because the light is just going right to the image sensor, and it then has a feed that goes up to the electronic viewfinder. Perks to mirrorless. Like I said, faster, better in low light, better autofocusing, better object recognition. They're smaller, they're lighter weight, they're not as cumbersome. It's a huge advantage in the camera world going mirrorless compared to DSLR at this point, until maybe 10 or 15 years down the road when we have our next big boom in technology. But this is the part of the camera class where I talk about buttons, layouts, what each button does, the shape of it. From there, what I will say is that these images are a DSLR camera body, so it's going to look slightly different if you have a mirrorless camera. However, somewhere on the mirrorless camera, you will have these buttons, so you'll be able to see them. We'll start with the video start and stop. There should be a red dot or a red circle somewhere on the top of your camera. That's going to indicate the video start and stop. Simple click of that button will start the video or stop the video. Your power switch. Power switch is going to be pretty self-explanatory. That's your ability to turn the camera on and off. Typically it's a switch, and typically it's next to the shutter release. The shutter release is your ability to take the physical photo. If you do a half squeeze on the shutter release, you're going to focus in on the image. A full squeeze will make that shutter close and open, which will then take your image. Exposure compensation. It's kind of like a yin and a yang symbol, but you should see a white plus inside of a black triangle and a black minus inside of a white triangle. What that's doing is it's making the exposure go higher or lower, darkening or brightening the entire exposure of your photo. Typically you touch that button and then you can use what's called the command dial, which is below that. That'll then help you change everything that's on there and make it either higher or lower. If you're in the automatic setting though, you probably will not have access to that, so be aware of that. I skipped a couple though. We have the mode dial. Now the mode dial I really think is important. It's very important. The best analogy I can give to this is if you drive a car, your mode dial is your gear shift. It's your ability to move from park to reverse to neutral to drive to 1 or 2. But basically what that does is it lets you switch between automatic, manual, aperture priority, program auto, shutter priority, those sorts of things. So if you're trying to switch on the camera, and the one I will recommend right now, please, for all that it's worth, stay on automatic. If you're brand new to photography, you've never picked up a camera before, automatic should be your first starting step. Once you get past automatic, or once you feel comfortable with automatic, then progressively move forward with whatever camera settings you want. The live view, now DSLRs will have live view. You pull that live view switch, you switch between the screen and the viewfinder. However, if you don't see that on your physical mirrorless camera, press on the display button and that'll switch in between. Like I said, start with automatic. That's going to be your best friend. That's really what's going to help you take better photos, especially when you're just getting started. The mode dial, all brands do it a little differently, and I use this slide to kind of show it off. There's a lot of symbols and different things that you'll see on there. But auto, the green camera button, A+, those are all intelligent auto. Those are all meant for your camera to really take the wheel and for you to do the most minimum work. So if you're a fan of how the iPhone takes a photo and it's a quick snap, done, you're moving on, then you probably want to start with automatic. So auto or A+, that's auto control over settings and functions of the camera. M, full manual control over the camera's array of functions. A or AV is aperture priority control, which we'll talk more about next week. S or TV is shutter speed priority control. Again, we'll talk more about it next week. Program auto, so aperture and shutter speeds are automatic, but everything else is changeable. That should be your next step once you graduate past the automatic phase. And then bulb, B. You won't see this on many cameras anymore, but that camera is fully customizable. But as long as you're holding the shutter release, the camera's going to stay open. It's great for long exposure or for fun, more interpretive shots, or if you ever want to get into astrology photography, this is the way to go. Scene modes, you won't see much anymore. Those were big on DSLRs. But to really break down scenes, those are automatic modes with specialized functions. If you have more questions on that, I probably would come talk to me about it. Or just shoot me an email or give me a call. My information will be on the last slide there. But you really won't see scenes being used much anymore on mirrorless cameras. If you do have any questions, just chat away. I'll answer all the questions you got. Moving forward, flash button. Should be a little thunderbolt going down. Press that, the flash pops up. Function can be a little different on all the different camera models. However, function will usually either open up a quick menu system to make certain changes when you're not in automatic. Function can also be a programmable button where it can then let you change things like your exposure compensation, or maybe it helps you change things like your light metering, or maybe it changes things like your focus parameters. There could be a bunch of different things that it plays with. Take a look at what your function button is. If you don't like what it is, go to your settings and you should be able to customize that, especially if you have a function 1, 2, 3. A lot of cameras will have multiple function buttons, or C buttons on there for that matter too. FN can also be an I button. It can be a Q button. Later on, it's going to be an I button when we flip the camera around to see the front screen. But just keep that in mind. Zoom ring. If you have a telephoto lens, the zoom ring will give you a wider or tighter focus. Focus ring, if you're not using an automatic focusing, that's going to be your way of focusing on the camera. If you're doing videography, I definitely recommend using manual focus. If you are doing standard photography, autofocus should do just fine for you. Lens retract button, if you hold that button down, some of the older camera models had it where when you weren't using the lens, it would lock into place so that it couldn't move or telephoto in and out. In order for it to telephoto, you would just hold down the lens retract button, and then that would click, and you'd be able to then start using the lens. Lens release button, hold that down and counterclockwise turn. That's going to remove the lens from the camera body, line up the two dots on the camera, and then turn clockwise. That's then going to click the lens back into place. If you're changing lenses on your camera, or you have a camera that changes lenses like a DSLR or a mirrorless, it's an important button to know. And last but not least, drive mode button. So on the camera you should see a stack of squares or a little circle timer. Basically what that does is, if you ever watch a sports, anything sports related, and you see photographers on the field and you hear that sound, that's the drive mode button. That's an action. The longer you set the drive for, the more photos it'll take per second. If that's not something you want to do, and maybe you're doing a set timer for your photos, maybe you want to take a photo, run in front of the camera, then you can use the timer function. That's your ability to switch between those two different types of shooting or modes. We have the menu button. Clicking on that can give you things like time and date changes, or some of the other features I mentioned about changing, like function button. Diopter adjustment. If you wear glasses like myself, much like binoculars, or when you go to the eye doctor and they say A or B, 1 or 2, that's what the diopter is doing for you. It's moving that piece of eyeglass back and forth until you get the best viewing possible through the camera. Much like doing a half click on the shutter release, the focus exposure lock, pressing that button will lock in the exposure for you, so then you can just take a quick picture on there. Some people enjoy that because that's where the thumb is, so they can hold down and then click. Image playback is pretty self-explanatory. Press that button and you're going to be able to look at all the photos you took. The I button is very similar to the FN button, so depending on what type of camera you're using, the I button might be your quick shortcut into things like your light parameters, your focus type, your shutter speed, things like exposure compensation or auto white balance. That's all stuff that might be controllable through the I button. Click on it, take a look and see what it has to offer. OK buttons, your enter button on the camera. Multi-selector is your D-pad, that's your way of moving around. If you used a Nokia phone or a Razr or any of the old flip phones, You can remember going through and pressing the multi-selector to get to where you wanted to be, whether that was contacts or camera or whatever it was. Hitting OK, the enter button, then brought you to that screen. Magnify button, demagnify button, pretty self-explanatory. And then delete button, also pretty self-explanatory as well. The camera buttons are really not that complicated. I find most customers, most people who are just starting out, have a problem with understanding aperture, shutter, ISO, things that really change and differentiate what your camera will be doing. And while those are important, I still recommend, and I stay with it, stick with the automatic setting. It's going to do you the best favor for the beginning photographer, and as you continue to learn and want to progress your knowledge, you're going to get better and better with it, and it's going to make more and more sense. Had a customer email me this photo years ago. My camera doesn't work. I like to use this expression a lot. I like baseball. It's not always the bat. Sometimes it's the baseball player. You can sit there and say that my camera doesn't work. However, if you're not using the proper settings or you're not understanding it properly when it comes to how to use the camera, you're going to get photos that look grainy, pixelated, dark. They don't look proper. Take your time, stick with automatic, and over time your skills are going to develop as you become more and more confident with your product and as you become more and more interested to learn the next steps. It's like playing an instrument. Nobody picks it up and no one's Van Halen right off the bat. It takes time to learn. Your camera is in a smartphone. Again, they designed the smartphones to be very quick and easy, so that way if you want to take a photo instantaneously, you can. If you want to post it to social media, you can. Where's the photo? It's right on your phone. I can text that out, I can email it out, I can drop it in Google Drive, I can do whatever I want with that photo. Camera might take a little bit more time for setup, for focusing, for tracking. It's important that as a photographer, as someone who's buying or possibly buying a camera, you take into account that until you become faster with your product like you are with your cell phone, it's not going to act the same. Can your camera do everything the phone can? Absolutely. It just might not be as quick and easy as it is on the phone. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Image quality is exceptionally better. Sometimes use and ease is a little bit lower. So it's kind of weighing those two options as you're going in between them to figure out what's best for you. This might seem silly, but I do like to mention it. Photography, art in general, anything where you're using your hands, shoulders, back can lead to arthritis or to carpal tunnel, or just to lower back problems and other problems in the body. So good posture is always important. Keeping your arms down is always important. Keeping one hand on the side of the camera and one hand under the lens is how they design cameras to function and work. The reason they did it that way is because it's easy for you to change the parameters on the camera, and then your trigger finger and your focus finger are all here. So you're manipulating your camera up here while using your lens to either zoom in or zoom out or to focus and refocus. Keeping your arms down too prevents accidents from happening. If you're taking a photo and you're at the park, or maybe you're at the zoo and kid bumps into you and hits you, if you just spent thousands of dollars on that camera, or even at the low end $400 to $500 on a camera, and that drops and hits the floor, you're going to be really upset with yourself. So keep your elbows in. That's your support system. Keep your back level and nice and tight so that way you don't have any back problems. When it comes to taking a photo, think about it the same way you lift. You don't lift with your back, you lift with your lower legs. Focus, then shoot, and shoot through the picture. Too many people will sit and they will look at one part of the photo and focus in on it and take the photo. However, as important as that is, you gotta remember that the photo is everything within the frame. So it's important that we don't just focus on one little object, we focus on the entirety of the frame. We then shoot, and we shoot through the picture. Again, we're trying to capture the entirety of that image, not just one little part. So again, focus through it, take the picture, and you should be able to get the end result you're looking for. If you or the camera are moving, you're going to get blurry photos. It kind of goes without saying. A lot of the times I see customers or people who are starting to take photos, They focus in slightly, but they get blurry photos because they don't either focus in all the way or because they're trying to run and gun. If you have a problem with being shaky or blurry, then use a tripod, use a monopod. That'll help a lot. Otherwise, put the camera strap on the camera and pull on the neck. That sometimes will help. It does put a little strain on the neck, so be prepared for that. However, it should help you get a better end result. Date your body and marry your glass. This is probably the best advice I received as a beginning photographer. This is the best advice I could really bestow onto any beginning photographer. When it comes to your camera, your body's going to get old. And that's to say with anything. But the camera body itself, as you take more pictures, think about it this way, where I set the mode dial is like your gear shift on your car. Your camera body has what's called a shutter count. When you hit a certain shutter count on your camera, the camera itself starts to become slower. It stops retaining light as well. It ages. Cameras are only as good as their shutter count. The more pictures you take on your camera, the more stress you're putting on your camera. And with that being said, the sooner you're going to need a new camera body. If we can date the body to the point where it's easy for us to change and replace, or we marry that glass, we invest our money and our hard-earned dollars into the most important part of the camera, which is the lens, then it's going to go a long way. So in my case, in all photography case, you'll hear it all the time, date the body and marry the glass. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit more about lenses. That's the second most important part. When you're coming in for a camera, you can buy a kit, which is fantastic, and I do recommend it. A camera body with a lens. However, if you are a beginning photographer, or if you're a more experienced photographer, I should say, or you've had a camera once or twice before, you've been told information on how cameras work, you might want to buy the camera body and then a separate lens. They might find a lens that's more appropriate for you. Let's say you're a birder, you like birds, and now we're getting closer to the fall season. Now that summer's starting to wind down, migration is going to start where birds are going to leave for the warmer climates. You might want to take photos of that. So getting a lens that's 18 to 50 might make no sense, but getting a 70 to 200 lens might make more sense. So buying a camera body and a separate lens could be an important factor. These are things that you should research and take a look at on your own time as well too. But if you have time, pop into any of your local camera shops and ask questions on that. People love to talk about that because when it comes to viewing, there is no one lens to do it all. And there are some lenses that are pretty close, and we'll talk about that. But most lenses are designed with a specific purpose in mind. That could be to reach a further distance, to get a wider shot, to get a nice tight angle, or for a better term, to blur out the background and make a perfect portrait. There's a lot of different lenses out there. Focal length and zoom, we'll start with this, are the same thing. Now, I'm no scientist. I've never made a lens before. I've watched actually a couple people on YouTube who actually make their own lenses, which I think is really cool. They have ways of 3D printing and wrapping and doing all this stuff. But some way, some shape, and some form, a scientist or engineer out there figured out that if you can cut glass and crystals into a certain pattern, and you stack them in an orientation, and you zoom in or zoom out with them, they're going to register distance. That distance for photographers is millimeter size. The smaller the number is, the tighter focus you have, the wider focus you have. And the larger the number is, the wider of a focus, or the tighter of a focus you get. I apologize. You can see it pretty clearly up on the board right now. If we look at this picture right here, 70 millimeter, we see everything, which almost washes it out. The main focus is these birds in the middle. We're getting none of that. But if we want to get the marshy, wet area, the swampy kind of texture that's out there, we get the whole shot. We want to get a little bit more close to the action. 105 brings it in. Now remember that when we zoom into an object, much like when we focus and then shoot through the whole image, when we zoom in on an image, we're not only bringing the thing that we want closer, we're bringing everything closer. And that background specifically, especially when it looks like this with the birds and then the kind of forested area with the mountains and town in the background, can become extremely close. You're seeing that with the 105 where it really starts to cut in. At 200, we get even more out of that. And at 400, we're almost right on top of the birds with only the trees and a little bit of the city poking out in between. It's that little bit of change within the numbers that can drastically bring an object closer to us. So again, if you're someone who's interested in taking pictures at your kid's baseball game and you have to sit all the way up in the bleachers, maybe a zoom lens is a better one to go with. If you are someone who is taking interior photography of landscape, of architecture, you probably want a wider lens. If you're a portrait photographer, then you probably want something around that 50 to 70 range. That's going to be a perfect portrait. These are things to keep into consideration when you're taking photos. That's another reason why I do like recommending the kit lens. It's a great way to get started without necessarily getting to the point of, oh, I don't know exactly what I want to take pictures of. I'm just going to take a wild guess and buy this extra lens. Start with the kit product. Get that kit lens. Take time with it. A month, 2 months, a year, to really figure out exactly what it is do I want to take pictures of. Focal length also equates to compression. You can see that not only is compression a big factor in this kind of GIF or GIF, but it also brings that background closer. Now the compression comes with the face. If we stare at the face when it hits the 16 millimeter mark, which is the tightest angle, or the widest angle, that face of the kid becomes extremely narrow. Glasses bend backwards, and we almost get kind of a needle nose effect. If we then get into the larger number of 200, the face becomes more full and plump. Depending on the subject matter and depending on how we're taking the photo, this is an important thing to remember. If you take a photo with a 14 to 24 millimeter lens, because you're trying to get wide angle, and you have someone standing in front of you, they might look very skinny or very tight. And if you take a picture with a 200 millimeter lens from a distance, they might look chunkier or bigger. Those are things to keep in mind, that distortion or compression happen as you're using the lens. So keep that in mind as you're taking pictures. If something doesn't look right, then it might be because of the lens that you're using. There's no way to really fight this. It's just important to remember the lens you're using based on the subject you're taking pictures of. The other thing to keep in mind is, much like that picture with the birds earlier, with a couple diagrams, just watch how that tree comes closer and further away. The bigger the lens is, the more we're pulling in front. So even though this kid doesn't look like he's moving at all, our background is getting closer or further away, regardless of what we want. Now let's break down common lenses. Let's say you are the person who doesn't want to get the kit lens. Let's talk about them all. Start with the kit lens. Kit lens is usually going to be something that's a variable aperture. Variable aperture on this one being 3.5 to 5.6. It's typically going to be something that's easy in the sense of wide angle to portrait. They want to give you the ability for you to do both. Just that way it gives you a taste of what photography can do with the camera that you just purchased. In this case, 18 to 55, that's a nice wide angle to portrait. Let's say that you're out in the cottage, it's a beautiful day in the lake, you want to get the whole lake and the boat as it sits in front of you, 18 is probably your best bet. But now let's say it's your kid's birthday party, they're about to blow the candles out on their cake, you can get real close to them as they do that. 55 is the perfect portrait, so now you can really get a good shot of them right as they're about to blow their candles out and make their wish. That aperture on there really comes into play when we talk about manual control or when we talk about aperture priority control, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week. But to kind of give you a rundown on it, it's about as much light as you can let in, as well as the background to foreground separation. The best being 2.8 for a zoom lens like this one, and the best being for a prime lens being 1.2 or 1.4, which we'll talk about next. So this kit lens can let a fair amount of light in, but it's not necessarily the best for low light situations. However, it hits at a good 18 to 55, so that's a good wide angle to portrait. So it's a good starting point without breaking the bank. The Nifty 50 or the Prime, and I mentioned Prime a second ago, is going to be your next step. I personally think that the Nifty 50 is one of the best lenses out there, and everybody has their personal favorite prime. I will say that my personal favorite, I use it almost every time I go shooting, is 35 millimeter. 35 millimeter at 1.2 is one of the purest and best forms of street photography lenses you can buy. Why? Because it offers you a wide angle while offering little to no distortion on a portrait. It's a fantastic way of getting an image either in kind of more of a wide angle portion or getting a picture of, let's say, the family out in the park or at a event. The reason they call it the Nifty 50 is because the 50 millimeter is the closest thing to the human eye that we have. Using a 50 millimeter gives you a fantastic photo, little to no distortion, and the best part about it is that if you can get it down to its best version, a 1.2 or a 1.4, you're going to blur the background out completely. You're going to blend in a lot of good light from the photo, and you're just going to get a clean, good image. If you're a portrait photographer, or this is the route you want to go in, 50 millimeter prime is going to be the best. But the reason we call it a prime lens too is because prime lenses only use one number. So where the other one was an 18 to 55, this is only a 50 millimeter. Meaning that if you want to get closer to an object, you got to move closer. If you want to back up, you got to back up. With a zoom lens or our kit lens that we were just talking about, we can use the variable aperture or variable zoom to then bring us closer or further away from an object. So there's things to keep in mind with both of these lenses, and there's reasons why one lens would be better than the other. Let's talk about the pros and cons at the very end. The next lens is a telephoto zoom. Similar to the kit lens, these are variable zooms. So in this case, I have a 24 to 70 on the left from Canon, and from Sony in the G, I have the 70 to 200. Both are fantastic. You can get both at a 2.8 aperture. Those are going to give you the lowest you could do on zoom lenses. Why? Is mainly because the lens would have to be extremely wide, and it would probably cost upwards of like $10,000 if it was any lower. But with either of these two lenses, they're great for zooming in on an object. They're great for street photography. They're great for birding. They're great for variable photography. If you're going to be taking events or spacing, 24 to 70 is a great one because you get that wide angle, or you can get a portrait. I actually have a photo event tomorrow where I'll be using a 50 millimeter to film for most of the day, and my 24 to 70 to take photos and other candidates of when I'm walking around. Yeah, not much else to say on these guys. Prime versus lens, zoom. So let's put it this way. Prime lens, one number, the lowest aperture possible, 1.2 to 1.4, means the most light you can let in, the best background blur. Con to that lens is that if you're taking a picture of something and you need to get closer, there is no zoom, so you walk up. And there is no way to zoom out, so you back up. Also, to keep in mind too is that it's only one number. So if you want to get something that's wide angle, you're not going to be able to do it, especially if you're indoors. You can back up all the way to the corner, but there's going to be things that you possibly miss in a wide angle, even with a 50 millimeter, and even with a 35. That's where zoom lenses come in. Zoom lenses give you the ability of having a 2.8 aperture, which is still very good, but doesn't let nearly as much light in as a 1.4 or 1.2. You're going to get good zoom on the lens, which will help for you to get closer or further away from your object. However, typically they're also bigger and bulkier lenses, which means that you might need a tripod, or you might need to be aware of the neck strain that you have. The next thing to keep in mind too is that they don't let nearly as much light in, which is I think the last point that I have on these guys. They don't let that much light in. low light photography and nighttime photography can be very difficult unless done on long exposure. And long exposure is going to require a tripod or a gimbal or something for stabilization so you don't get a blurry or shoddy image. So they both are fantastic lenses, but both have their pros and cons. Now, if you don't care about any of that, you just want a lens to do it all in one, then the travel lens might be the one for you. And I save this one for last because these are typically just a step, basically a step to the side of a kit lens. They're not necessarily your best zoom, and they're not a prime ball. However, if you're someone who just wants a jack of all trades, a master of none, then this would probably be the one for you. This lens right here is an 18 to 135, which would give you wide angle into the zoom. I get customers that come in that are going on safari, and they're like, you know, I just need a lens that can get me a wide image if I'm seeing a plane in Africa, but then I can zoom in and see the lions as they're devouring a zebra. This is the type of lens. It's great for not low light situations. If you're in an area with a lot of sun, or it's bright, or you're not too worried about the background to foreground separation, this is the way to go. If you need something that can just give you that extra oomph to zoom into something, but then at the same time cut back and be wide, this is the lens for you. If you're looking for a lightweight counterpart, this is the lens for you. Now, is it great for that background blur? No. Is it great for low light photography? No. Is it going to be the best for stabilization? No. There's a lot of cons to this type of lens. However, for people who are going on vacation, or again, I use that reference, safari, all the time. I get customers who come in left and right and buy this specifically because they're going to be going to Africa, and they're going to be sitting in a Jeep, and they're like, what if I see a gazelle, 100 yards away? Am I going to get an image? Well, you might be able to get one with a telephoto, but then if you zoom out with a telephoto, you're not necessarily going to get the wide angle, and that too, it's going to be pretty heavy. Travel lens is built to be light, it's built to be an all-in-one, it's really made to be a best of both worlds without giving you something that's multi-thousands and thousands of dollars. What lenses do you need? And I put air quotes around need. I have professional photography friends who have a kit lens and they don't need anything else. They edit their photos and make them look amazingly beautiful on the computer. I have friends that have every single lens under the sun and they are collecting dust because they only use a few. And then I have other friends who have every single lens and they use every single one for a different purpose. I put quotations around need because I feel as if we don't need anything, we want them. But if you truly are sitting there and you're like, you know what, Saxon, I have an unlimited budget, what do I actually need? I would tell you to buy the Trinity. Buy yourself a 50mm prime. You're never going to be upset about a prime. Even if, let's say, you want a 35mm, take a couple steps back, get that wider angle. Buy a prime lens of some sort if that 50mm still doesn't sound good to you. Prime lens is going to be your best for portrait photography, your best to blur backgrounds out, your best for anything. If you're a product photo guy, if you're taking photos for menus for restaurants, if you're doing photos to display in hotels or maybe even in galleries, whatever it is that you're trying to do, the prime lens is going to be your best bet for that. Then from there, a 24 to 70, the perfect street walking lens. You want to take street photography. A few weeks from now in Chicago, we're going to have the DNC in town. It's going to be a prime time to take photos of just all the craziness that might occur downtown or in the city. Or let's say that you're getting ready for Lollapalooza right this weekend, and you want to take pictures of people walking in all their fun outfits and what they're wearing. 24 to 70 might be the perfect one. You can get a picture of the multitudes of buildings and people walking, but when you see that one person who's wearing an Allen Iverson jersey, you zoom in a little bit into the 70mm and get a perfect portrait of them. And then let's say you're the bird photographer, or you might do bird or astrophotography of the stars and the moon. A 70 to 200 is going to be perfect for that. Zoom in on that, you're going to get a nice background blur with a 2.8 aperture. It's a heavy lens, but you'll probably use a tripod anyway. That's going to be perfect for those types of shots, distant shots. You're covering all your bases when it comes to the trinity of lenses that you have here. That's a great way if it's for a photographer to have one of everything. You get all three of these lenses at the best quality possible. Throw them in your camera bag with you and take them with you. You'll probably never need another lens in your life. Last thing I'll talk about, or I have a couple little more slides, but use your timer and your camera app. The timer is great, but that camera app also offers the timer on there. Transfer a couple photos to and from the camera. Use it to set the timer on there. And a lot of these apps, like Nikon, Canon, and Sony, have a photo editor built into them. So if you want to just make a couple adjustments on a photo, maybe it's too dark, you want to lighten it up, you should be able to do that all on the physical app itself. And then just save it to your phone. Text it to a couple friends, post it on social media, whatever it is that you want to do. Highly recommend you download the photos to your computer, get the bigger screen so you can see everything on there really nicely, and then kind of delete what you don't want and save what you do want. That's the best way to do that. Other ways to get into content creation, that's a big one too. People who want to get more into videography. You definitely want some form of stabilization and a microphone. A lot of camera brands have different kits for you to get that exact setup. And if you don't want to, you can piece it together easily. But if you're someone who's brand new to this, you want to start your own YouTube or cooking channel, or maybe you're vlogging for something, or you're making more content for social media, look into one of these content creation kits. It's an easy way to get started without breaking the bank. Here's my recommended accessories. And I'll be honest with you, I think you need the top 5 easily. Get a camera bag. You just invested all this money into a camera setup. Protected camera bags have special padding in there to ensure that when you're traveling to and fro, nothing happens. Extra battery and extra memory card. Just like the memory card might not work, like I said in the beginning, sometimes you don't charge your battery, or the battery doesn't have enough juice, or it dies spontaneously because it's an older battery. Have that extra battery in your bag at all times. You won't regret having an extra battery. You will regret, though, going to a photo event or going somewhere to take photos and then not having enough juice and then being stuck with your cell phone. Get a camera lens cleaning kit. It's usually just a rag and spray. Never use your sweater or your t-shirt. You can put micro scratches on the lens and on the products, and over time those will build up. When I say that investing in your glass is the most important thing, same thing in protecting your glass. Treat it with your best effort. Don't damage it. Spray a little spray on there and wipe it down with a microfiber cloth. It goes a long way. And a camera strap too. I am a big stickler on putting my camera down on surfaces because number 1, someone could knock it. Number 2, someone could steal it. But then number 3, I might just forget about it and walk away. If I keep that on my neck, keep it strapped up with me, I'm never going to forget it. And then a tripod is another good accessory if you have a hard time with stabilization or you got a big bad lens. An external hard drive like we talked about earlier. Various filters like polarizing, neutral density, UV. If you have questions on those, you can ask me separately on that one. And then additional lenses like we just talked about. Start with a kit lens. If you've done research on it, buy the camera body only and buy a lens that's going to fit your purpose. Don't just buy a lens to buy one. Make sure you have a reason. And if you don't have a reason but you know you want a camera, go with the kit lens. You won't be disappointed. And then classes and workshops. My class is one way of getting started. I'm a very intro basic method way. I'm trying to teach people who just bought a camera. I'm trying to teach people who are trying to get to the point of buying a camera, what they should be doing and looking at. Next week we'll talk a little bit more advanced and kind of get more into things, but for starters, for just beginning camera people, additional classes and workshops are fantastic. Get more familiar with the camera, become more knowledgeable on the product, and then eventually it all makes sense. But it all comes with practice. I can teach you everything and tell you everything in one video. We can stay here for 5 hours, but if you don't go out there and actually take photos and practice, it doesn't matter what I say. The bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of a low price is forgotten. It's one of my favorite Benjamin Franklin quotes. Here at Apt, we're all about making a good deal and getting you, the customer, the best price and the lowest price possible. Sometimes, though, when it comes to camera items, the lower you go on that item, the lesser of quality you're going to get. And it might not seem like that in the beginning, but especially as you become more advanced in your photography, where you start becoming more select on what you're taking photos of, that that sweet price or sweet deal you got might get lost in the fact that this is a bad picture, or it doesn't look like how I want it to look, and I can't get there no matter what settings or things I change. So be conscious of that when you're buying camera equipment. Get a good deal on the things that you want that'll make you better at photography, but if it's just there and you think that, you know what, that's exactly what I want, and it's $2,000 less than the highest end one, well, there's a reason for that most likely, so keep that in mind. And that's all I have for you guys. So thanks for being here. This was the entry-level class for photography. Next week we are going to have intermediate class. Now this is one of those months where we have 5 Thursdays. So I want to give everybody kind of an update on how this works. We do a class the first, the second, the third, and the final Thursday of every month. Meaning the 4th Thursday of this month there will be no class. So if I look at my calendar right now, today is the 1st. That is the entry-level class. The 8th will be intermediate. That'll be the next class that we have. That's next week. The 15th is the following Thursday after this. That'll be the advanced camera class. The 22nd, there will be no class. We will then have a class on the 29th, the final Thursday of this month, before we then jump into September. So keep that in mind. Today was intro. The 8th is intermediate. That's next week. The 15th is advanced, and then the 29th is the beyond the traditional camera. Excuse me. So yeah, that's all I got for you guys. I'll leave this open for a little bit longer. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, go ahead and chat in there. Or take a picture of the screen, give me a call, shoot me an email whenever. My days off are Tuesdays and Wednesdays. If I don't answer, I'll get back to you that day, or I'll give you a call the next day when I'm in. I usually respond to emails pretty readily, so if anything, just shoot me an email and I'll get back to you on that one too. But even if you had a question about something and you didn't want to ask it on here, you thought it might be silly, go ahead and email and ask me then. That totally works too. I'll give it a couple more minutes here, guys. About 6:35, I'll jump off. Alright, well it is 6:35. There was no other further questions on here. Sorry about that, guys. A little more water. But yeah, if anything else comes up and you have any other comments or questions, feel free to call or email me. Next week we will have our intermediate camera class, and you will all see me there. So have a great night. Keep shooting as always. My name is Saxon, your host, and I will see everybody next week for intermediate camera class.